time once again for Community Forum. And we are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning, Chuck Reinsch. Chuck Reinsch is a former volunteer, former morning program producer, former program director, former station manager, and former board of directors member and board president at KRAB Radio. KRAB Radio used to be here in Seattle at 107.7 FM in Seattle. And he is now the archivist and historian for KRAB.fm, a website where you can find a lot of archived material from KRAB Radio. Chuck, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you.
So KRAB is in some ways is actually, I think, a predecessor to multiple stations and organizations here in Seattle. We'll get into what branched out of KRAB. But if you start out, tell us how you got involved with the station.
As a youngster, I got into playing around with radios and electronics, got interested in the idea of FM. I had no idea really what it was, but got a kit tuner, put it together, and one afternoon, listening on headphones, tuning across the dial, gradually made my way to the right end of it and heard this strange sound coming out of the headphones. Indian music. This was in, late 1963, mid 1964, somewhere in there. So it was before the Beatles had discovered the Maharishi. It was before they had done Revolver. Indian music wasn't by Indian, I'm talking about the East India. People hadn't heard much in the way of sitar and sarod and that kind of stuff, and I was fascinated. What was making this strange sound? And then a voice came on and explained it to me, and they sounded like no other radio announcer that I'd ever heard. It was both laid back and relaxed, and it was as if they were speaking to me directly in the house. It was a conversation. And then they said, this is KRAB Seattle, and I was hooked. And I just started listening then. Eventually, I heard a poetry program, and that poetry program I needed a poem for school. And mind you, this was, I don't know where I was. I might have been in the 9th grade at that point. I needed to recite a poem. I heard one during that program on KRAB and called them up and asked if I could get a copy of it because I couldn't find that poem in the library. Took the bus into Seattle, went up to the station. They made me a tape of it and told me that I could volunteer. Well, I didn't immediately, but fairly soon thereafter I did, and the next thing I knew, I was up there folding and addressing program guides, eventually going out and doing remote recording of speeches and lectures. And then eventually I got a third-class radio telephone license and was doing engineering, operating the board for another person who announced. And then it just went from there.
So talk about the early days of KRAB. How did it come about? My understanding from reading your website, KRAB.fm, is that correct?
Correct.
Is that it was it aspired to be one of the original Pacifica stations. It
was started by two of the people that founded the station. There were three of them. Lorenzo Milam was the person that filed the application for the license. Seattle was his second choice. His first choice, he wanted to get a station in Washington, D.C. He was from the East Coast, or he is from the East Coast. And Washington seemed to him a place that needed a station. He got turned down there, and so ended up with his license in Seattle. But he did that, sort of to backtrack a little bit on him. His background in radio initially was something like mine, although he did it 15 years before I thought of it at all. He grew up in Florida, heard a lot of radio in the South and from the East Coast. As an adolescent, ended up doing some programming back there on some commercial stations, and then had his own dream to get his own station. Went to Haverford, where he met a fellow named John Gallant, who was the second founder. John Gallant is a former geneticist at the UW. When Lorenzo got his construction permit to build the station in Seattle, he came out here, got a location. Oh, I have to digress. I got to go. When he'd been at Haverford, he had volunteered at their radio station. And so this is back in the mid-50s. So this is early college radio. Well, not the earliest of college radio, but I think they were actually doing something there back in the 30s. But that was before Lorenzo's time. After he graduated, he went out to Berkeley. And when he was in Berkeley, he volunteered at KPFA, where he met, a lot of the Pacifica people, and also met the third founder of the station, Gary Margison. So Lorenzo gets the construction permit, sends Gary Margison to Seattle to find a location for a studio and a transmitter site. Lorenzo comes out here, looks around. They find their location, and Lorenzo, John Gallant, and Gary Margison form the Jack Straw Memorial Foundation, the nonprofit that is intended to manage and own KRAB in the future once it goes on the air. So that's how it happened. But it was intended to be a station similar to Pacifica in that it would be listener supported. That was Lou Hill's concept of, Lou Hill being the founder of Pacifica, his concept of how you could have a sustainable station that would be free of commercial interests and able to program material that other radio stations wouldn't touch.
And so KRAB developed a very eclectic and free-form format and content.
KRAB's programming was everything that one could imagine except what you'd hear on any other radio station. And that was essentially the rule, was that the programming would be selected based on that criteria. If it's something you can hear somewhere else, it's not going to be on KRAB. So there would be panel discussions, lectures, interviews, speeches, poetry readings, music from other countries, all of these things essentially unedited, so that the speakers would be allowed to cover their subject in as much detail, as much as they possibly wanted to say, without feeling as if it was going to be rendered down to a sound bite. The concept of sound bite didn't exist back in '63, but people were used to seeing their material being edited and being selected, much like it is today, for the most sensational or provocative kinds of statements, edited down to that. And KRAB would avoid doing that. But it's like all that programming would then be assembled every two weeks. It would be scheduled in such a way that it might seem random, but it wasn't random. Programs, I mean, a discussion about politics in Haiti might be followed by a program of Haitian music. I mean, there would be some sort of relevance. Sometimes, however, there would unavoidably be its programming that might be a little jarring from one to the next. And for me personally, there was the element of surprise, and this sort of jarring effect would actually accent what was coming next. But it was all put into a program guide with the assumption, and the subscribers to the station received this program guide every 2 weeks, and that told them when they could tune in to hear the programs they wanted to hear. The assumption was that no one would want to listen all day long, or for 6 hours or 5 hours or 2 hours. They would want to hear only those programs. It would be like a magazine. You might subscribe to it because there are 2 or 3, or buy an issue because there's 2 or 3 articles that you want, but you might not want to read the whole thing. And was sort of the logic of what happened on KRAB.
And physically, the station was located in what had been essentially a residential area, a small house up on Roosevelt.
Yes, it was a former donut shop. It was very small. Well, maybe a little bit larger than this room. I think our main studio and office was about the size of this room. And then we had another room for the transmitter, and then a control room that was about the size of a typical 1950s bathroom.
And the antenna was that literally like right outside?
It was. It was an old phone pole right outside. So it's on the top of Roosevelt. So it had remarkable coverage for the area. I mean, there were pockets in Seattle just because of all the hills in Seattle where they couldn't get it. But it was pretty good when it was at full power. I mean, when the transmitter was working on those rare occasions.
And that in itself is another aspect of the station. Is you started out with some pretty ancient equipment and and just went from there.
Actually, that ancient equipment continued. That was with us for a long, long time. No one knows what became of it. The transmitter, depending on Lorenzo's mood, as he tells stories. It's like sometimes it was built in 1946. Sometimes it was pre-war, pre-Civil War. I think it was from 1948 that transmitter was originally put into operation. And he got it second hand or third hand via mail order. And it showed up, and it took KRAB's first engineer, Jeremy Landsman, it's like a year to get it going. And then it took another 10 years of continual maintenance and remodeling to keep it going. Eventually, though, it moved up to Cougar Mountain, where we got lucky one year, and the fellow that had donated WBAI to Pacifica gave KRAB $10,000, and we used that in order to buy some property up on Cougar Mountain for a transmitter site. It still took us about 10 years to actually get there, but when we got there, we were able to cover all of Western Washington from one Vancouver to the other.
So how did you support the station?
Well, we didn't. It would be an exaggeration to say that we barely supported it. During the first few years, theoretically, it was to be listener supported, which meant that listeners subscribed to the station like they subscribed to a newspaper. Except, of course, it's radio and you can get it for free, which most of them did. But it's like we were charging in the first years, it was $12 for a subscription, a normal subscription, $9 if you were a student, $6 if you pled poverty. When doing pledge drives, I used to comment that it's like people were spending more on beer in a month than they were willing to pay to subscribe. But that was the theory. It took us, the most subscribers we ever had that actually paid up was about, I think, maybe 3,000 but on average it was down between 2,000 and 2,500, which was not enough to support the station. So Lorenzo, who did come from a wealthy family, used a lot of his personal wealth to support the station. So he'd make up the difference when the bills came due there in the first years. Then in 69 or 70, he left Seattle and went off to start radio stations elsewhere. And we were on our own. And so we tried getting grants to little success. For a while, we got some money from CPB, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Lost that. Eventually ran up a lot of debts. And that's what eventually brought about the end of KRAB back in 1984. We sold it off and created an endowment, and that was then used eventually to start KSER.
And what happened to the frequency for KRAB?
The frequency was sold to a commercial broadcaster. It became the End. Was it KNDD?
Yeah,
Something like that.
sounds right.
Yeah. And the programming reverted to what virtually all of the rest of the broadcasting world was doing. Commercial pop of one variety or another.
You were telling me before the show that actually KRAB was the pioneer of the whole marathon drive concept.
Yeah, it was. This is contested a little bit between WBAI and KRAB, but I think I've demonstrated to BAI that we beat them by a few months. The first marathon was in the fall of 1963. this predates me being at the station, but I have the program guide. And it's like they just decided that they needed to raise some money because they were having trouble paying the bills. And Lorenzo was tired of reaching into his wallet. So they went on. Their goal was, I think, $1,000. And they were really excited because they raised, I think it was $1,200. But it was just, they went on the air and they asked for money, which was something that he wrote about that he really disliked, because he described it as the closest that he felt that they had come to sounding like a commercial broadcaster. I mean, a commercial station. Normally it would be sort of once or twice a week, somebody would get on there and mention, well, if you'd like to see a sample copy of a program guide, call us up, and if you like it, maybe you'll send us some money. Then they'd forget to give the phone number or give the address or any of that information, and somebody would have to call up and tell the announcer. These were all volunteers, mind you, that tell the person announcing, well, you might want to tell them how they can contact you.
As callers generally are, so good with offering suggestions like that.
Yeah.
So there was, were there any staff positions, paid staff positions at the station, or was it pretty much volunteer driven?
Most of the programming was done by volunteers, but it was program production. In terms of staff, Lorenzo served as the manager program director in the first year. Gary Margiston, I think, what was he described as, the poetry director. I don't really remember what their titles were, but they were pretty meaningless. Eventually, a program director was hired. I think the first one was Nancy Keith, who was years later to become the founding manager of KSER. But so she was the first program director. So that was a paid staff position. Then there was eventually a station manager hired, and that was at the time that Lorenzo was beginning to divorce himself from the station, and that was a staff position. Gradually over the years, more staff positions were added as the funding became available. Sometimes they were added when the funding wasn't available. In the 70s, we did something that, in retrospect, seems like it was kind of risky. It might have been a mistake because it ended up giving us a lot more staff than we could sustain. But there was a program called the Comprehensive Employment Training Act. And what it did is, this was in the early 70s, I guess it was in the mid-70s. It was during a time of high unemployment in Seattle and in other parts of the country as well. What it did is it enabled government agencies as well as nonprofit institutions to get to hire people and be reimbursed for the cost, assuming that they were doing programs they were doing activities that contributed to the community, and that they were learning job skills. We were able to hire 6 people on that program. When the program dried up, however, we no longer had the money, and that coincidentally was also at a time when CPB, as I said before, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is one of the funding agency for the public broadcasting, the television and radio. They were requiring stations to employ a sizable have a sizable staff in order to qualify for the funding. By attempting to meet their qualification standards, we just went further into debt. So it was a spiraling cycle that was very unfortunate.
So after KRAB's demise, then the spinoffs were KSER, and the Jack Straw Foundation exists now too.
Those were the spinoffs in the terms of the money that was raised from the sale. But there were other stations spawned by Lorenzo and Jack Straw. Jack Straw also contributed to a station over in Yakima that's still on the air, KDNA, which is one of the few Spanish language public stations in the country. I filed their license application in 1976 as an employee of Jack Straw. So they're still around. And KBOO in Portland was also a Jack Straw station. And it was actually a repeater for KRAB back in 1968. So there's still some of the old KRAB nebula. There was at one point a network of stations called the KRAB Nebula that we all participated in, a kind of informal program exchange.
Just a couple minutes left. We're talking with Chuck Reinsch. He is a former station manager and program director at KRAB Radio, 107.7 FM here in Seattle. And he is currently the archivist and historian for the station. And you have a website, KRAB.fm, that you are constantly looking for more content for.
Yes, thank you for reminding me of that. I've been running on here. Yes, if people will please check out KRAB.fm. It's nonprofit. There's no commercials there. It's the domain is a .fm, which is French Micronesia, but it's also frequency modulated. You'll see samples of KRAB program and program guides, and a request from me that if you know of somebody that used to be a listener or a subscriber to the station, I would really like to know about them, and perhaps they'd like to know about the website, because we're continually searching for more material that people might have saved, and we'd really like to get it digitized and preserved so that people can see what radio was like back then in the heydays of the 60s and 70s.
It's an amazing collection, what you have so far of audio and text and brochures, and it really gives you a great feel for what was going on at that station and what a valuable resource it was.
We've digitized about 300 program guides, about 350 hours of audio so far. I just put up a program that Mike Wallace did about KRAB from 1967. It's a short one, but it's interesting. I'm a little disappointed in Mike Wallace, but it's interesting. So it's only 6 minutes, and you can go here to krab.fm.
All right. Well, so hopefully some folks who are listening will either have some of your materials themselves or will know of someone or perhaps mention to them. Get some more flowing your way.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Well, thank you for having me.